Welcome back, folks, to another episode of CamBro Conversations. And today's conversation, we are talking about vitamin D, why we should take it and how much. In order to do so, we're lucky to be joined by Dr. Dan Owens, PhD of Liverpool John Moores University. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on.
And I think, as we were saying before we started recording, Dan, the aim of the podcast has been on numerous occasions now to pick a high-level, fairly complicated subject, bring on an expert, an academic more often than not, and bring it down and distill it into actionable terms. And I've been lucky enough to hear you on a couple of different podcasts. And I know we were going back and forth trying to get this one booked in terms of fitting in with your busy diary. And I'm glad we've been able to get you on because I've heard how you convey ideas and how you're able to do that. So I guess I'm excited to really dive into a topic where there is a lot of complex information, but so many actionable steps that the general population can take.
Absolutely, yeah. So no pressure there for me to get it right and dumb it down. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'm excited to do that. And yeah, again, one of the things we were talking about before is, this is one of those areas where oftentimes the key information doesn't really get across to everyone. So hopefully we can cover that today.
Yeah, exactly that, Dan. So for the listeners' benefit, how did you end up in this area of research, and a little bit about your background in terms of all the different stuff you've done from academics through to sport?
Yeah, so I started my journey in science, I guess, at Liverpool John Moores University. So I did an undergraduate degree in sport and exercise science there. I'll be honest, for most of that degree, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. It's not like I had an idea that I wanted to go and do research or anything like that. But I was just quite fortunate that towards the end of the degree, Professor Graham Close sort of took me on as a mentee and gave me some sort of background in different areas. He became my major project supervisor, and then at the end of my degree sort of introduced me to vitamin D. And then about a year later or so, he offered me a PhD opportunity, and that was solely focused on vitamin D. So that's really where it kicked off, and I've sort of maintained that research focus ever since. And I guess coming from a sport and exercise science background and being mentored by Graham, who is a really good practitioner as well as academic, I also had some opportunities to work in professional sports as well along the way. So I've worked in Rugby Union with a number of different clubs, and one of the highlights being the youth teams at England Rugby. I worked with some individual athletes during my time at John Moores as well. And more recently, I've worked in football and rugby league. So we had a little chat before about Hearts, who I worked with for a few seasons. And I also used to work with Warrington Wolves as well. So I've kind of maintained that balance between doing research, but also, trying to translate it for people who it might impact, in which case they're athletes.
And again, Dan, I think that's why you were such an attractive guest, in that you, like you say, you've got this very deep understanding knowledge. You've done your research, you've done countless hours in the lab and slaving away to get your PhD, but ultimately you've taken it out there from an actionable practitioner perspective and delivered it to sports teams. And many of the listeners to the podcast won't be professional athletes. However, we all quite often will strive for peak performance in our 9-to-5 careers alongside being at our absolute best, most healthy and performance within the gym or whatever chosen sport that we're diving into. So again, that's the kind of genesis of why we were so keen to have this particular conversation. And I think vitamin D is your area of expertise. So why don't you give us a little bit of a history on vitamin D and where it comes from?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep it short. There is kind of a long background to it, but I think really where vitamin D was discovered was alongside the other vitamins in the sort of early 1900s. And it was around this time where we knew there were a lot of diseases that were being caused by lack of something in the diet, but we just didn't know what it was. And so a lot of researchers were looking at what are the components of the diet which, if we don't get enough of them, are leading to these diseases. And that's essentially how vitamin D got discovered, because at the time there was this disease called rickets, which is, you might know as a sort of soft bone disease or bendy bones in children. You might have seen the bowed leg pictures of children with rickets. And it was around the time where this was rife. And what they were able to discover at the time was that if we provided enough vitamin D, so in the form of cod liver oil at the time, it could prevent this disease, rickets. And on the back of all this, vitamin D was discovered. Because it was sort of discovered in that way, it got the name vitamin D. But I guess over the sort of the years following that, researchers sort of started to discover that it wasn't really a vitamin, in the sense that we don't really need a great amount of it from the diet as you do the other vitamins.
Okay.
Where we get most of it from is actually from exposure to sunlight, which I guess we can talk a little bit more about down the line in the podcast. So that's, I guess, a brief history, and everything in between has just been really focusing on how or what does vitamin D actually influence, which different tissues in the body, which processes, and so on.
From a research perspective, then, has there been periods where it's like jumped forward in terms of our understanding of it? Like you say, we initially it was titled as a vitamin, whereas now we're kind of appreciative that it comes from different sources rather than just our food or a supplement. Was there a period where we maybe gained a much greater understanding really quickly?
With a lot of these things, as is the case for most scientific discoveries, they come on the back of a development in technology. So usually if you see a big leap forward in anything, it's because we've developed a new method to look at something in more detail. So essentially any of the major improvements in our understanding of vitamin D have been on the back of technological developments, really. So I wouldn't pick out one particular moment where or a group of moments where things kind of jumped forward. But what I would say is that, in the past sort of 20 years or so, 10 to 20 years, we've seen a real renaissance in the interest of vitamin D research. It's really come back to life, and we've learned a lot more about it than we knew previously, which was kind of its role in bone because of how it was discovered, related to rickets and so on.
Yeah, that makes sense, Dan. And I think, like you say, when it comes to technology, we're in as strong a place as we've ever been. We've not gone backwards from a technological perspective. So, in your recent studies, you'll have been well equipped to understand as much about vitamin D as we've ever done so, and hopefully, you can see that from an applicable perspective with all the different studies and athletes that you've started to work with. So, first things first, how do we understand why or who's deficient in vitamin D? How do we get our head around the reason that so many of us are potentially deficient in the UK?
Yeah, so I think in order to sort of grasp that, it's important for us to have a think about what the risk factors are for vitamin D deficiency, and we should also define what vitamin D deficiency even is.
Yeah.
So in terms of risk factors, because we produce most of our vitamin D, 80 to 90% of it in the skin, under the action of ultraviolet B in sunlight, any sort of factor that might block that ability to synthesize vitamin D in the skin is going to be a risk factor. So you can think of things like geographical location, or an indoor lifestyle, wearing clothing, sunscreen, anything like that is going to be a risk factor for producing enough vitamin D. When we think about the UK, we're in a particular sort of mess because of our latitude as well, our geographical location, which means that for most months of the year, from let's say late September through to March, April, there's so much cloud cover and the angle of the sun is so low that we're just not going to produce hardly any vitamin D. So there's a massive risk for us, and the further north we get, if we go up towards Scandinavian countries and so on, further away from the equator you get, you're going to see less sunlight for more months of the year. So really it's about anything that can limit sunlight exposure is going to be a risk. In terms of what is vitamin D deficiency, deficiencies are anything which, if we don't have enough of a given nutrient, it's going to result in some sort of physiological problem or disease state. And there's a categorization for this, which it's disputed, it's often debated, but it's currently all that we have, which is from the US National Academy of Medicine. And they basically break down vitamin D levels, so the vitamin D that circulates in the blood, depending on how much of it you've got, you would fall into a category. So they have categories of severe deficiency, deficiency, inadequacy,
Yeah.
adequacy, and so on. So depending on how much you've got of this circulating vitamin D, you'll fall into one of these categories.
Yeah, that makes sense, Dan. And I think the first point you've made there around the further north we are, so of the equator in the UK, we're fairly far away. We don't get that exposure to sunlight, which is one of the, or is the main source of vitamin D on our skin and filtering through to us absorbing it, so to speak. Are there any countries in the world that you could potentially live in and pretty much get enough vitamin D almost year round?
Yeah, absolutely. So countries around the equator for sure,
Okay.
because for most months of the year, you're going to see adequate sunlight exposure at the correct angle. Um, Even in the UK and you know latitudes further north or further south away from the equator, you can still produce vitamin D in the summer months.
Yeah.
So even in the UK, if you were to spend enough time in the sunlight during the summer, you'll maintain a normal vitamin D status. So current guidelines for that is basically spending 15 to 30 minutes a day with your arms and legs exposed in the sun and avoiding sunburn. And there's research out there to show that if you do this throughout the summer months, you can maintain your vitamin D status. But
Okay.
it's those winter months, and the fact that we have such a long period of cloud cover and a lack of sunlight, which means that for many months of the year we just don't get that.
Yeah, and it's almost that cumulative effect there that you're speaking about in terms of it's so many months without almost recharging your vitamin D or getting any
Yeah.
exposure at all for even one day at a time means that our deficiency almost worsens potentially.
Yeah, so it's something that we need to regularly get. It's not something that you could have a massive dose of, and then you're just going to be fine for ages. It is something that constantly needs to be topped up. One thing I would say is that there is some research that shows that if you do get enough vitamin D exposure, so sunlight exposure through the summer months in the UK, you can pretty much almost maintain your vitamin D levels through the winter, although they do decline. But the problem is most people don't get that adequate sun exposure in the summer for many reasons. We all work. Not many of us have the luxury of being outside during the sunlight hours in the day. So you might not even have that ability to do that. And many people also wear sunscreen even when they do go out, which completely blocks any vitamin D synthesis in the skin as well. So although it could be possible, it's unlikely for many people that you're able to do that.
Yeah, and equally, I'm thinking there of the immediate challenges, like you say, the working day. If you do go out on your lunch break for half an hour for a walk, you may be wearing work clothes as well, so you're not exposing your arms and your legs to the sunlight to get the maximum effect. I mean, if you're wearing a short sleeved shirt to work, maybe, but chances are you're probably not wearing shorts in most
Yeah.
in most corporate offices unless you've got a really flexible dress down policy. So we're not getting that exposure, like you say. So even though there maybe is a percentage of people who maybe work outdoors during the summer months who can maintain their levels or they don't drop off as severely and become deficient during the winter, the general population here are not falling into that bracket, unfortunately, Dan.
Yeah, that's correct. So that's why this has become such a hot topic, and why we see such high rates of vitamin D deficiency in the UK and in countries at a similar latitude and above us as well.
What kind of studies have you done in recent years then to assess deficiency, and how do we know that people are deficient? Obviously, we know the theory that we don't get enough vitamin D, so we would assume that people are deficient, but how do we know, so to speak?
Yeah, so to answer the first question, the studies that we've done have mostly been on athletic populations. So other groups, other universities have done large scale studies where they've assessed the general population, and those sort of studies showed that individuals had a lack of vitamin D in their system, which I'll come on to in a minute. And our studies basically aim to look at that in athletic populations and answer the question, are athletes and active and healthy individuals also at risk as well?
Yeah.
In terms of how we measure it, it has to be measured from a blood sample. So that can be done through a dry blood spot, which is a technique that's become more and more common in the past couple of years, or it can be just blood that's being drawn from a vein, which is the sort of what you would get if you went down to the doctors if you had a normal blood test.
Yeah.
And there are particular laboratory techniques that need to be used in order to appropriately determine this. So once you've had one of those tests, what it's going to give back is this marker, which is a vitamin D metabolite, and it's called 25-OHD, which the long name for that is 25-hydroxyvitamin D.
Okay.
And all that basically is a vitamin D metabolite which reflects how much vitamin D you've got in your system. And that is the marker which we use to then categorize you. So if, for example, you have less than 12.5 nanomoles per liter of this, you are severely deficient. If you are 12.5 to 30, you're deficient. 30 to 50, you're inadequate. And above 50, you're considered to be adequate.
Okay.
So that's essentially how that works.
And of the athletes, how many were typically falling into that 50 bracket where we're happy?
Yeah, not many in the winter. So some of the early studies were done by, at the time, my supervisors, so Professor James Morton, where they looked at that in Liverpool football players, so from the professional team. And they basically saw what you see in the general population. In the summer months, all the players had adequate vitamin D. In the winter, right down, and they had inadequate and deficient levels. In some cases, some people even had what would be verging on severely deficient. We followed that up and we've looked at that in rugby players, jockeys, a number of different sports. And it doesn't seem that anyone is really immune, if you want to call it that, from being vitamin D deficient. If you've got these risk factors that you're not seeing enough sunlight in the winter, you're not getting any supplemental form of vitamin D, then there's a risk for an athlete, for a healthy person, just as there is for anyone else.
I think that's really important to understand that, because most of us would consider ourselves athletes from a training perspective alongside our work. But even these top level athletes who are paid to perform at their best are falling into the bracket of being deficient if they don't take the required steps that we'll get onto as the podcast goes to rectify these and end up in the best possible position from a health perspective when it comes to vitamin D. So I do find that quite, not alarming research, but quite interesting, because it probably gives you even more of a case to get your message out there in terms of, listen, even top paid athletes are falling short in this respect because of the lack of information that's available from that perspective. And certainly in kind of bodybuilding, aesthetics focused training, which I've fallen into over the last few years, a lot of people do take vitamin D, but there's probably a lack of understanding about its impact and dosages and whatnot, and I'm sure we'll get onto that. But one of the key topics I wanted to cover with you, and I think it's probably been heightened by the COVID period, and I appreciate that's not an area of your expertise, but ethnicity in vitamin D was raised because of the nature of it absorbing through skin. Can you cover that a little bit for us, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'm absolutely aware that there's been some talk around this and the fact that ethnicity may play a role in the severity of COVID outcomes. But from that perspective, yeah, you're right. I'm certainly no expert. But what I can definitely comment on is how ethnicity and the color of your skin affects how much vitamin D you can produce. And, the simple way to think about this is that the darker the skin that you have, the more exposure to sunlight you would need in order to produce the same amount of vitamin D. So there's been plenty of research done, which has looked at different skin types, which get categorized on a sort of a 5-point scale, looking at if you've got darker skin, so more melanin in the skin, how effectively can you convert sunlight and the vitamin D precursor in your skin into vitamin D.
Yeah.
And basically, all we see is that, yeah, the darker the skin that you have, the less chance you are going to have to produce vitamin D, in short. What's interesting, though, is that individuals with dark skin, despite having low vitamin D levels, often don't have the clinical outcomes associated with vitamin D deficiency.
Okay.
And that is one area of this whole sort of vitamin D ethnicity debate, which really is still a developmental stage of research, in my opinion. There have been a lot of research efforts on it, but it still isn't really well understood why that's the case.
That's interesting. And I think when we're talking about like the ability to uptake and produce vitamin D based on the darkness of our skin and potentially maybe our longer term heritage, depending on where we initially lived or our ancestors lived, and based on how much sun they got, they were probably exposed to greater levels of sun, maybe lived near the equator, whereas being born in the UK but having that heritage, your body's not quite adapted yet to the fact that we don't get as much sun and obviously that vitamin D which we require.
That's a great point, and I think it's a really interesting theory as well, because one of the theories about how we evolved was this sort of out of Africa theory, which is that one of the sort of birthplaces of humanity was this sort of equatorial area in Africa where there's a lot of sunlight. And because of that, we evolved to use the sunlight to meet one of the needs of the body's needs, which was vitamin D. And as we've over time migrated away from this sunny area, we've gradually lost pigmentation in the skin, so that sort of darkness in the skin. But it's happened in sort of, even though it's hundreds of thousands of years, in evolutionary terms, it's not that long. So we haven't really caught up with the fact that we're not experiencing enough sunlight yet, as you correctly stated there. So I think it's a fascinating theory. I don't know how it will ever sort of be proven, but it's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. And I think it just gives us further context around why we need to supplement and why maybe people of different ethnicities, there's maybe even more of an imperative on them to supplement. Although, like you said, some of them don't have the same impact, despite the fact that they maybe don't uptake as much vitamin D, they don't suffer the same ill effects. So let's dive right into the topic when it comes to athletic performance and the impact of being deficient or in fact having the correct levels. What kind of impact does it have on athletes?
So yeah, I think there are, I often say that there are three main areas of how vitamin D might impact athletic performance. And it can do this directly or indirectly through having an effect on something else in the body, which might impact performance. But the three key areas really are muscle, the immune system, and potentially the athlete's heart. And we'll also touch on bone, but I'll explain why that's a little bit of a tentative one. With regards to muscle, there are sort of two branches to this. One of them being muscle force, so the ability to produce force, lift weight, produce a lot of power, whatever it might be. And there is some research that shows that if you've got severe vitamin D deficiency, and probably over a prolonged period, this can affect your ability to produce force. It can affect muscle function, is what we'd refer to it as. So we did some studies on that in the past. We didn't find anything, but we didn't have people in our study who were at that range of severe deficiency, whereas other research studies have shown that. So if you group all of this research together, it looks as though if you're going to see any negative effects on muscle function, you would need to be at the sort of real deep end of deficiency.
Yep.
But where we do tend to see more pronounced effects is on the ability of muscle to recover from damaging exercise, and particularly eccentric exercise. So that was one of the pieces of research that I performed during my PhD. And we basically found that if we took a group of individuals at random, we test their vitamin D, and then we include people in our trial who are vitamin D deficient. We tested their muscle function before and after a period of supplementation and their response to a bout of eccentric exercise. So quite a big stimulus that results in a loss of force that recovers over a sort of a period of a week. And what we found is that following supplementation, you see an improved ability to recover force following these eccentric contractions. So your recovery from damaging exercise has been improved. And we also looked at some sort of cellular mechanisms to support that as well. So for me, that's sort of where there seems to be a more pronounced effect, and it's an area that we're actually going to look at in a lot more detail as well. I think just a final point is that we're also now looking at the ability of the muscle to produce energy, so energy metabolism in the muscle, because this also seems to be affected by vitamin D as well. So, there are a number of different aspects related to muscle that could translate to impacts on performance for the athlete. But not just the athlete, anyone who's really interested in staying fit or going to the gym, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
From an immunity perspective, the immune system is known for some time now to be heavily regulated by vitamin D. So if you don't have enough vitamin D, you're going to see some sort of impact on your immune system. Now, from an athletic perspective, some work that came out of Loughborough University a long time ago now showed that athletes who had low vitamin D were more susceptible to upper respiratory tract infections. So that was sort of one of the really nice landmark studies that kind of set this area off. And more recently, Professor Neil Walsh from Liverpool John Moores University, where I'm based, he's ran a study which has basically looked at the response to getting a vaccination. So, of course, the reason you get a vaccine is to give you an immunity to a particular disease or virus.
Yeah. And
basically what Professor Walsh has shown is that insufficiency of vitamin D actually gives you a weaker vaccination response.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's, not just for athletes, but for the general population at the moment, that is a really important take-home message, because, we're going to hear a lot about vaccination over the next the foreseeable future. So immunity for sure. I think, if there's anything you're going to take home from this point, is that your immune system definitely has a need for vitamin D. And from a heart perspective, one of our collaborators, Richard Allison, so he was formerly at Arsenal and based out in Qatar as well. He basically looked in a really large amount of athletes, around about 1,000 athletes. He studied the structure and the function of their heart and basically looked at how it might differ depending on how much vitamin D you have. And really interestingly, he found that the sort of adaptations that you normally get in an athlete's heart are kind of lost if you don't have enough vitamin D. So it seems that the ability to adapt from a cardiovascular perspective might be hampered if you've got low vitamin D levels. So a really interesting area, definitely requires more research. The bone one is kind of, the reason I said I was a little bit tentative about this is because we know that bone is a super important target for vitamin D, because we talked about rickets earlier. If you don't have enough vitamin D, you're going to end up having weak bones and so on. The problem with that is that in athletes with low vitamin D, they actually seem to have pretty normal bone mineral density, which is a sort of the main marker of how healthy the bone is. And the reason we think that might be the case is because exercise, lifting weights, running, anything that is weight bearing has a real profound effect on how healthy our bones are. It's called an osteogenic stimulus. And it appears that seems to outweigh vitamin D deficiency when it comes to bone health. So although we know bone is a target for vitamin D, it doesn't seem to really be a massive concern for weight-bearing athletes. It might be a bit different for people like swimmers or jockeys who don't spend a lot of time actually weight-bearing, but for the majority, seems to be this interest in paradox, I guess.
All four of those are absolutely fascinating. I was just rapt listening to you there, Dan, because I think from a performance perspective and a health perspective, some of them fall into one category, some of them fall into both. And I think when we're talking about muscle damage, a lot of the people listening, their ears will perk up, and the kind of famous phrase, you can only train as hard as you can recover. Because if I go in on a Monday and I'm not recovering from the eccentric loading that I'm putting on through deadlifts or squats or leg press, whatever I'm doing, then I'm not going to be able to go again later that week to tick off the kind of twice frequency that I'm looking to get from my muscle groups.
Mm-hmm.
And so many people listen to this will be thinking about recovery, and loads of people talk about delayed onset of muscle soreness and how to solve it. And one way to ensure recovery is better is through having adequate vitamin D levels so that we can go again and train again. Because like you said, it's maybe not necessarily affecting your force output on the day unless you're chronically deficient, but longer term, your performance is going to suffer if your muscles aren't repairing. And it links into that one that falls into both health and performance. Your heart is maybe not adapting, improving your cardiovascular fitness, improving your ability to perform across multiple different sports and multiple different activities, then you are hampering your ability to be better longer term, because ultimately we need to increase our load, progressively overload what we're doing, regardless of whether it's lifting weights or whether it's running further, running faster, being able to last longer in a 90-minute match of football at peak performance.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're hampered by being deficient in vitamin D. So I find it fascinating around both health and performance, Dan. And I guess the last thing to touch on, apart from the bone, was with regards to the immunity. And if you are able to stay healthier and not contract respiratory infections, or we'll open the vaccine box in a minute, but goodness me, if you're able to stay healthier and not fall foul to infection, you can train more. You can train more consistently throughout the year without having to take breaks. So I found that absolutely fascinating, Dan, that those kind of different areas fall into both health, but also performance for both those of us who want to be office athletes in terms of our career and our fitness, but also just general population who want to look after their well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think you hit the nail on the head when you say that this is about making sure that we're healthier for as many days of the year as we can be, and maximizing our ability to adapt and recover. That's what this is about. And I think that kind of, in a way, segues into a really important point that I always try and stress, which is that vitamin D isn't ergogenic. It's not a sort of thing that we can take or get that's going to improve your performance if you're already vitamin D replete. You know, in the way that you might take a supplement like creatine, we know there's quite a lot of evidence behind creatine, or caffeine, for example. What you're getting is an improvement on top of the natural state. And that's not what we're seeing with vitamin D. What we're seeing is a loss of these things that we're trying to correct for. So I think it's a really important point. But for sure, look, I mean, it's not just athletes, and it's not just you know, the people that we study in our type of research, but it's anyone. And I think, you know, even if you think about wellness from a work perspective, and people who are really striving to get the most out of their career, you don't want to have days off from work ill. And if that can be partly prevented by maintaining something as simple as your vitamin D status, then, you know, I think it's something you'd be silly not to focus on.
Yeah, the fact that you bring up absenteeism from work is massive, because away from the podcast and away from taking my top off on Instagram, I'm very much, I work in the corporate space, corporate insurance, and we look at people's people risk as well as part of our broken services. And the amount of money that companies lose to people being off ill is going through the roof, and that's well away from the COVID period, which has probably been even more severe. And people supplementing correctly or getting adequate dosage of lots of vitamins, but also importantly vitamin D, which we're covering today, is probably a way that companies could ensure, and individuals can ensure, that they're present in work more often and at peak performance while they're there. They're not run down with a respiratory infection. They're not suffering from even the common flu, which as an asthmatic I get vaccinated for. But if I'm deficient in vitamin D, even my fairly bog standard flu vaccine, which has been around for years and years and years and nobody's absolutely terrified about the potential results of, I might not take so well to that, and I might not be able to utilize that vaccine and fight off flu infection. And then if we open the can of worms, which is the COVID vaccine, what you've said this evening and what your colleague, Dr. Walsh, am I correct in saying?
Yeah.
What he's uncovered is that if you are deficient in these key vitamins, your ability to maximize the use of that vaccine is actually significantly down, and you're far less likely to be protected in the way that you feel you might be from getting that shot in your arm?
Yeah, that's it. You know, I mean, the point of vaccines is to stimulate this immune response to allow us to produce antibodies and have our own immunity against whatever it is we're trying to fight off. So it's calling upon our immune system to do a job. And given that vitamin D has direct roles in the immune system, it kind of makes sense. You know, Neil Walsh has just kind of proven that. It's just kind of shown that, you know, the vaccination response is weaker if you've got insufficient vitamin D. So, yeah, you know, it's a really important take-home message. And again, yeah, you're right. When we're thinking about COVID and this area, they're actually during this period, just to give you an idea, there's been about 20 or more papers on vitamin D and COVID. You know, some of them are just theoretical, some of them are more experimental papers, but there's clearly a massive interest in how important this is from a public health perspective related to what's going on.
Well, I know off the back of these things, I've taken vitamin D for probably 5-6 years now, but my parents were asking me, they're in their mid-60s, and they're saying, oh, we take some of the multivitamins that you take, Colin, but can you bring round some vitamin D, because we saw in the news about it's linked to COVID and whatnot, and it's good that it's getting out there in that perspective.
Yeah.
But I think we've got the buy-in of the listeners at this point, Dan. If they've not thought about vitamin D before, they need to think about what on earth I'm going to do about this, because there's so many benefits that are fairly within reach by getting adequate vitamin D. So how much should we take? What is the kind of dosage that we're looking for? And is it the same year round, would be my kind of initial questions around that, Dan.
Yeah, so I guess there's a few bits to touch on. First of all, people may go away and look at, for example, the NHS website, or they might have a look at places, like the NHS, or depending on, you know, if you've got foreign listeners, their country's sort of healthcare system's website, and that'll give you something in the region of sort of 600 to 800 international units of vitamin D per day. Now, the sort of standard international unit is is IUs. So if you see that on a packet, that's what you should be looking for. There's usually a conversion on there anyway between micrograms or whatever else it's measured in, but look for international units or IU. So you'll probably see this sort of 600 to 800 per day, and to be honest, this is outdated, and that's generally recognised now in the medical community as well, that this sort of daily intake of 600 to 800 international units is too low. It doesn't seem to maintain vitamin D status. We've done studies ranging from 1,000 up to 10,000 international units a day. We've even done studies where we've looked at giving it as a bolus dose once at the beginning of the week, because often actually in athletic populations that works. The logistics of that is a lot more favorable, because you go to an athlete once a week, you don't have to think about it again, go on, crack on, go and do what you need to do. But what we've found is that the higher doses, so the likes of 10,000 international units a day, or giving sort of 70,000 for the whole week at once, these are not favorable. These are not this is not the best way to do it.
Okay.
It does improve your vitamin D status. It will make your vitamin D go up, the one that you would normally measure. But in the studies that we've done, we've actually looked at a number of other things as well, which are indicative of vitamin D breakdown, for example. And what we've found is that those higher doses, although they increase your vitamin D, they also increase the rate of breakdown. And the product of that actually might not be very, very useful in simple terms. So we kind of advise against that. Where we seem to see it working pretty well, and other studies have supported this, the range of sort of 2,000 international units a day in the winter is probably going to be spot on for most people.
Yeah.
I would go with an upper limit of 4,000 international units a day. But I think if you shoot for 2,000, you're going to be safe. It's not going to be, have any harmful effects for you, and you're probably going to get the most out of that supplementation regimen. And you should be doing that daily rather than as taking it all at once, for the whole week, as an example. If you miss a dose, just miss a dose and then carry on, from the day after. and just know that more is not better. Okay, it's not an ergogenic thing. It's not something that, if one's good, then three's great sort of thing. We're trying to correct the deficiency. And what I'm saying here is the best way that you can achieve that. So, with this one, really try and bear that in mind and don't overdo it.
Yeah, I think the first thing you said around NHS or health board guidance around maybe 6 to 800 and it being out of date, so many of the listeners will be very interested in their fitness and their body composition. And the kind of national guideline is 50 grams of protein a day, which for anybody that wants to build maximal muscle tissue or hold on to it is not even close. We're talking for a male of our size, Dan, triple that potentially, or maybe even more that, depending on what your goals are. So it doesn't surprise me that when we're looking in a niche area like vitamin D, that the kind of general guideline is maybe not the most informed. It's just very much there as a tick box to say, oh, we've got information on that. Whereas experts like yourself are saying, well, actually, that's evolved since that research was generally accepted. It's moved on, particularly in athletic populations where we're looking to maximize things like our ability to recover from eccentric muscle damage, our ability to be immune to respiratory disease and be able to uptake a vaccine maximally. And then obviously our heart to adapt to all these different strains and rigors that we put ourselves under when it comes to our cardiovascular capacity. So I think that's very interesting that you've spoken about that. Second point, when I first read that vitamin D required more than your standard 800 or 1000 IU capsule that you would get from, and I'm not going to badmouth them, I'm sponsored by My Protein, but their capsules are very much at the lower end and they're the cheapest chips. But that's because you would need to take multiple of them to get near to the kind of 2,000 to 4,000 that we're speaking about. And I jumped straight up to 10,000 because I fell into that camp that more must be better. So when you're talking about the fact that once we get to those higher levels of 10,000, that we're actually, it's kind of maybe diminishing returns because we break it down so much that we don't actually get a useful byproduct, so to speak, if I'm using the correct term there, Dan.
That's right. Yeah, I think you've summarised that kind of well in the sense that you're diminishing returns. Really, that's a good way of thinking about it. Is that you are going to improve your vitamin D status, but you are also going to break down a lot of it, and that product of the breakdown actually might be quite detrimental to what vitamin D is actually trying to do in the body in the most simple way I could put it, I guess. But look, I mean, it's not uncommon that people pick up 10,000 IUs a day sort of thing, or even greater. And I don't want people to go away and be, sort of, I guess, scared about this as well and go, oh crap, I'm taking 10,000 or X amount a day at the moment. What I would say is that might not be the best thing to do, but we do know that it's not causing toxic effects, which you only see at 100,000 plus, a day, where people have accidentally taken a massive dose. So don't be sort of alarmed or sort of put off or whatever it might be. Just sort of start to bring that down to where you might need it to be. But yeah, for sure, I think they're great points that you raise.
I think giving us that sweet spot of kind of 2 to 4, taking it every day, building it in as a habit and a routine. When you take your other supplements, hopefully you're taking other vitamins to cover your other potential exposures, and that forms just part of your routine. And it's that kind of, don't worry if you've missed a day. It's not a case of doubling or tripling your dose the next time you have it, because that's not the way the body really is uptaking it from what we've discussed in terms of, if we were naturally getting this entirely, we would be getting it from sunlight on a daily basis, rather than one big whopping dose on a Monday and then not seeing the sun again till next Monday. So I guess what one of my questions within that was, should the dose for most of the listeners, which I think about 90% are in the UK, should the dose remain the same year round, or do we adjust it based on the sunlight that we have access to?
Yeah, so look, I would only be taking that sort of supplementation approach from the end of September, October through till March, April.
Okay.
And then you would be trying to seek sun exposure. At the moment, to be honest, I think how we maintain it through the summer months, when you might see a bit of sunlight but not enough, I'm not sure the research is really there on that, but I would not be going with the same high dose of like 4,000 IUs a day. I'd probably drop it down to like 1,000.
Okay.
If you're seeing sunlight though regularly, and you can see 15 to 30 minutes with your arms and legs for most days of the week, then just come off your supplementation during those periods. That's the way to think about it. You know, if you can get that sunlight exposure, then there's no need to be supplementing with it. In the same vein, if you're using sunbeds, you also don't need to supplement with vitamin D. And that's something that, you know, when I've worked with professional athletes, you know, we've tested them for their vitamin D status, and, you know, some players come back deficient, some come back with really, really good levels of vitamin D, and you think, okay, are they taking it from somewhere else, or, you know, why is it okay? And you kind of say, oh, are you on any of the supplements? Are you that might have vitamin D or whatever it might be? And you know, they're like, no, for sure, like I'm not doing that. And I'm like, okay, using sunbeds? And they're like, no. And they're like, well, look, your vitamin D is really good. Are you sure you're not using like sunbeds or taking a supplement? And then it'd be like, oh, well, maybe, yeah, no, I go on the sunbeds like once. It's only once or twice a week. But sunbeds, the UVB in sunbeds is sufficient to create vitamin D in your system. So if you are using them, obviously you won't have been for a while, because I'm sure they probably won't have been open. But if you are using them, then you don't need to be taking vitamin D.
Yeah, so that's really, really interesting, because I guess for starters, that approach to adjusting our vitamin D intake based on the time of year and our exposure to it and our lifestyle factors, because like you say, you and I may be working inside for large parts of the day. When we do go outside, we're not getting our arms and our legs exposed to the sun. We would probably take a higher dose year round, or reduce it down slightly if we do get access to that. And yet, one of my guilty pleasures, the sunbeds. Many listeners will be laughing. I like to maintain a decent tan year round, but it's been very difficult. It's been very difficult in 2020 indeed, because of the coronavirus and different lockdowns. They've been closed for 3 weeks now, so I'm gagging to get back on soon. But so if I'm going in the sunbed once a week and I'm getting that big bolus or big kind of input at once, would you say supplement throughout the rest of the week, although I've had that one big dose at once? Does it work differently to tablets?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that there aren't, and what I would say is there aren't any studies that have looked at combining the two or mixing and matching. You do produce quite a lot of vitamin D from a single exposure.
Yeah.
So if you're going once a week, I just probably wouldn't supplement on the day that you're going, and then maintain maybe a slightly lower dose throughout the week, because you do produce significantly more vitamin D from sunlight exposure than you do from taking supplemental form. But the difference is that the body regulates it on its own. So once you've seen enough sunlight exposure, you'll just stop producing vitamin D. The body knows when you've made enough, and it'll start to just convert it to things that are not harmful, that you can just get rid of.
Yeah.
So there is an advantage to getting it from the sun that you don't get from a pill form, which is that the body has its own regulatory mechanism for dealing with it. But I think it's it's kind of given me an idea for some studies, really, because people either do studies where they've looked at the sunbed use alone or pill form alone, but none have combined the two, or thought, well, you know, what are people actually doing in the real world? Maybe they're only going once a week or so. How does that maintain your vitamin D?
Yeah.
Do you need to mix the two? So I think it's a really good question that maybe I might try and do some research on that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to explore that. And I think many of the listeners who maybe during the summer months, they tend to, maybe if they're working all the time and they want to have a good colour for going on holiday or whatever, or not be milk bottle standing on the beach in the first few days they get there, they maybe will do 1 or 2 sunbeds a week, and it might impact their dosage. That's certainly interesting. Kind of second last area to cover with you, Dan, is what other sources are there that people can introduce that might help? I do see these Instagram posts where people say, oh, this food's really high in vitamin D. Are we talking about significant levels of impact through eating particular foods, or are there other sources as well?
Yeah, so the dietary sources from foods are just very insignificant, and that's why we can't maintain vitamin D sufficiency during the winter without either sunlight or supplemental form. The highest sort of sources of vitamin D are things like oily fish, um, mushrooms that have been dried out under the sun, for example. They have a fair amount of it. Cod liver oil has a bit of it as well, and some dairy products as well are kind of rich in vitamin D. But when we say rich, it's not going to significantly contribute to your vitamin D status. So obviously, I still recommend including all of those things in a balanced diet anyway, because they're all things that you would expect to see in a sort of well planned, a good meal plan. But it's not going to do a great deal for your vitamin D status.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about the vast majority of the audience and people like myself, we want the maximum returns from the kind of minimum effort. And if we're talking about supplementing once per day with a pill, rather than worrying about, oh, did I get enough oily fish in my diet this week? And obviously that would be maybe good from a omega-3 or omega-6 perspective, but the actual impact of introducing that, if you maybe you just don't like oily fish, then you're not really getting the return on that for battling through that dinner that you just didn't enjoy at all. So I find that interesting, and equally, I think for those that are maybe the anti-supplement brigade, that speaks to it, that really just you adapting your diet a little bit is not giving you enough of a return on investment for the difficulty that you're going to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, even when I've worked with professional athletes from a nutrition perspective, so that most of the support I would give to pro athletes is on a nutrition perspective. The approach that we generally take is what we call a food first approach. So it's not an anti-supplement approach, but it is heavily focused on everything that we want to try and get for this athlete in their diet. It should be coming from whole foods where possible. If we can't get it from whole foods, then are there safe supplements that we can use to get them to where they want to be? So an example of that might be creatine, because we know that, okay, there is a dietary contribution to creatine, but to get it to where you need it to be in order to actually have an ergogenic effect, you need supplementation. So I'm all for, having a food first approach, but there are instances where supplementation is required if you want to, for example, avoid deficiency, or you want to get the maximum returns from your training.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And yeah, I would echo those comments in terms of let's nail our food first. But for things like vitamin D, where food has that kind of lower impact and we really need that help, the supplements that we've talked about and the kind of levels and effective dosages tonight has been really helpful. I've absolutely loved today's conversation. We've dived into all sorts in terms of history of vitamin D, why we're likely to be deficient, particularly in the UK, ethnicity in vitamin D, how it impacts performance from a health, but also an athletic side of things, as well as how much we can actionably take. Last thing to ask you, Dan, is where's the best place for people to connect with you if they have any kind of follow-up questions or they want to delve into some of your research as well?
Yeah, so I mean, you can get me on Twitter. So my handle on Twitter is Dan_Owie, so OWIE. I also have a LinkedIn profile, so I kind of promote my sort of research there, but also some of the applied stuff that I do as well. And if you're interested in the research, I have a ResearchGate profile, which from the research community, that's often where researchers sign up and promote their research. So I have all three of those. I'll send you my sort of handles or the links to those, and feel free to pop them next to the podcast.
That's great, Dan. That'll all be in the show notes below. We've covered a massive topic tonight, guys, so please take the opportunity to screenshot it, pop it in your Instagram story, send the link into the WhatsApp group and be like, guys, we need to get on the vitamin D, we need to get involved, and here's how to do it. Without any further ado, I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.